to crashed Allied aircraft, each one marking a violent end for the young lives inside.
Well, for the moment, we know that roughly 6,000 Allied and German planes came down in Belgium. But we think that the real amount must be 7,000 or 8,000, we believe.
Mr. Hendricks has begun a museum from the proliferation of crashed aircraft in just his small village.
It's a small village called Meerhout. We got 3 crashes. The first one was a 466 Wellington bomber that came down here in 1942. Then the second one was the Liberator, the B-24 bomber that came down. And the third one was a Waco glider that came down here with the offensive at Arnhem.
By April of 1944, Wes and his crew had rounded 17 missions. They had moved up to a faster Halifax 3, and an RAF gunner, Robert Iano, had joined them in a new gun position under the plane. But the nights of fear were not over. The end of the 18-day German offensive meant for Belgium a return to relative peace. Most of the Belgian POWs were allowed to return. Initially, the German occupation seemed fairly benign. Many Belgians found themselves doing a good business with a well-behaved occupation force. Clearly, there were many happy to collaborate with the Nazis for economic, if not ideological reasons. But just as the German aggression was rooted in the past, so was the Belgian resistance.
Ik ken met 2 onkels in de oorlog van de Eerste Oorlog. Wij de Duitsers. Veel. Al de mensen.
I remember that we went to Dinard. It's a place where the Germans shot women and small children, you know, because they didn't find some of the patriots. They had escaped.
Of course, like all the students, we were against the occupation by the German because, you know, well, this freedom, we didn't have any freedom anymore.
You have something to do and you want to help, and it was the second time that the Germans came in the country. And my father went in the first and did not come home.
So the German came and go with horse on the street and on the footpath. So I said, oh no, it's not possible. So till the beginning we tried to do something against them.
Day-to-day life became increasingly difficult for the average Belgian. The Germans extensively siphoned off food and industrial resources for their army, making rations meager. When the war bogged down for the Germans on the Eastern Front, forced deportation of Belgians to the factories in Germany began. It peaked at 500,000 people. This action especially provoked an increase in resistance. In contrast, the German propaganda films of the time show civilians in the occupied territories volunteering to fight the communist menace in the East. The Germans also did their best to vilify the Allied air effort. Goebbels declared the mass bombings to be murder, not acts of war, and protests of bombing civilian targets hit the newsreels. Airmen who bailed out near German targets were prone to being beaten or killed by enraged civilians. In occupied Belgium, posters played up the very real casualties of the bombing raids and encouraged civilians to turn in any air crew that were found, to protect the peace and collect a reward equal to 3 months' wages. The penalty for helping an airman was death.
My grandparents were living in a town where a pilot was hidden during the war. And the pilot was arrested by the Germans, and due to that fact, the Germans took 80 civilian hostages in the town and brought them to the concentration camps, and only 8 of them returned after the war. Yeah. In Belgium alone, about 5,000 aircraft crashed during the Second World War. Let's say half of the survivors were able to contact the resistance, and then of those who contacted the resistance, still some were arrested later on. So I don't know the exact figures, but there are several hundreds who got back to England via the escape lines. And of course several thousands of people risked their life helping these airmen.
In spite of the consequences, helping airmen was a non-violent way the Belgians could protest the occupation of their country. One of the most successful escape lines was the Comet Line. Their motto, fight without arms.
Was a guide from Brussels to France. Every week in 43, every week 2 guides going in France with 2 airmen. Every week the 8 men going through the organization to Gibraltar.
And with Monsieur de Jong, very quick, he said to me, "Oh, please, do you want to go to Paris with some Englishmen?" "Oh, of course," I said, "that's my dream, of course." Because when we begin to make resistance, we always want to do something more.
Resistance groups often use cafes as meeting and drop-off places. One such cafe was the Petit Paon in Antwerp. Here, evading Allied airmen could be dropped off in the evenings with little suspicion. They traveled through a tunnel in the basement to a safe house in the bookshop next door, run by Yvonne Riet. Her husband had already been arrested for resistance activity. She was delivered airman by a man codenamed Donald. Claiming to be evading deportation to the German factories himself, Donald had won the confidence of the owner of the Petit Paon and delivered the first of 19 airmen to a nervous Riet.
Oh, I was scared. I was glad, of course, I was glad to see them, but I told you I didn't sleep that night, you know, and I sleep anywhere, but not that night. Because I thought the least sound in the street, I thought, no, I didn't know what happened, you see. And there were 3 young Americans, you see.
But the Abwehr, German secret police, were watching the Petit Paon.
Because one morning, a lady, I never know who it was, said that 2 of the men I knew had been arrested. And she said, yes, and they told me to tell you and see that you go away. I said, I can't go away, I've got my shop. You say, yes, I thought that was not very, because if I had been arrested, I couldn't have said to the Germans, I'm sorry, but I have to stay. You see, that was not the thing. But I said, but I can't go. But then I was scared. I thought, yes, and one of these days, Fernand will come back, and I won't be there anymore.
On April the 27th, Wes's crew was assigned aircraft E for Easy for a bombing mission, their own plane being out of service. Joining them for the second time was Robert Iano, an RAF gunner housed in the radar cone under the plane to counter the newly modified Junkers 88 with upward-firing guns.
We were bombing the marshalling yard right on the border of Belgium and Germany.
144 planes took off that night in 2 waves. Their goal was to knock out the railway yards at Montzen, so the German